The cafeteria smelled of cheap pizza and disinfectant, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes long after lunch was over. Students laughed, shouted, traded snacks, and lived freely in a space that was supposed to feel safe. But for Jamal Carter, lunch was never just lunch. It was survival. He sat alone at the far end of the table, shoulders slightly hunched, guarding a small brown paper bag like it was treasure. Inside was a homemade meal, rice, chicken, and greens, prepared carefully by his mother at dawn before her long shift. Jamal had learned early that food was not just nourishment, it was love. He opened the bag slowly, aware of eyes that always seemed to follow him, some curious, some judgmental, some cruel. He tried to ignore them. He always did. Jamal was used to being invisible until someone decided he shouldn't be. His skin color made him noticeable in ways he never asked for. His quiet nature made him an easy target. And today, unfortunately, someone noticed him far too much. Ms. Peterson, the lunch monitor and part-time substitute teacher, scanned the room with sharp, impatient eyes. She believed order was maintained through fear, not fairness. Her gaze landed on Jamal's table, then narrowed when she saw his food. "What is touch?" she snapped loudly, her voice slicing through the cafeteria chatter. Conversations died instantly. Jamal froze. His fork hovered mid-air. "Mom," he said softly. Ms. Peterson marched toward him, heels clicking like a warning drum. "That food doesn't look like it came from the cafeteria," she said with disgust. Jamal swallowed. "My mom packed it for me," he replied politely, just like his parents had taught him. She scoffed. "That's not allowed. You people always bring in things that smell and distract others." The word "you people" hung heavy in the air. A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others smirked. Jamal felt his face burn, but he stayed seated. "I didn't know it wasn't allowed," he said, his voice trembling but respectful. Ms. Peterson grabbed the paper bag without warning. "Now you do." She turned and dumped the food straight into the trash can. Rice spilled over the edge. Chicken hit the metal with a hollow thud. Greens slid down the side like they were trying to escape. Jamal stood up instinctively. "Please," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "That's all I have." The room was silent. Ms. Peterson looked at him as if he were something beneath her shoes. "Sit down," she snapped, "or you'll be in detention." Jamal's hands shook. His stomach growled loudly, betraying him. He slowly sat back down, eyes fixed on the trash can where his mother's love now lay wasted. No one spoke. No one helped. No one defended him. And as Jamal stared at the floor, fighting tears he had promised himself he would never let fall at school, none of them noticed the cafeteria doors quietly opening behind Ms. Peterson. None of them noticed the tall man stepping inside. His posture was straight. His boots were polished. His uniform pressed with discipline and honor. And stitched proudly on his chest was the proof of a life spent serving something greater than himself. Jamal's father had just walked in. Jamal didn't notice his father at first. How could he? His eyes were locked on the floor, tracing invisible cracks between tiles, trying to disappear into them. The cafeteria felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls were leaning in to watch his humiliation. His stomach ached, not just from hunger, but from shame. Miss Peterson turned back toward the trash can, dusting her hands as if she had just cleaned something dirty. "Rules are rules," she announced loudly, as though she were performing for an audience. "If students don't follow them, there are consequences." A few kids nodded, relieved it wasn't them. Others stared at Jamal with a mix of pity and fear, grateful their skin didn't make them stand out the same way. Jamal clenched his fists under the table. He had been taught never to raise his voice, never to cause trouble, never to confirm the stereotypes people already carried in their minds. His parents had drilled it into him: be twice as respectful, twice as calm, twice as careful. So he sat there, hungry and humiliated, swallowing the injustice like he swallowed everything else in his life. Ms. Peterson began pacing the aisle, lecturing about discipline and order, her voice sharp and self-righteous. She never once looked at Jamal again. To her, the problem had been solved. But behind her, near the cafeteria entrance, the tall man in uniform stood perfectly still. Jamal's father, Sergeant Marcus Carter, had come to surprise his son. He'd been granted a rare early release from base after months of training. He wanted to take Jamal out for lunch, hear about school, maybe see that shy smile that made all the long nights away worth it. The smile never came. Instead, Marcus saw his son sitting rigid, shoulders tight, eyes glassy, an untouched cafeteria tray in front of him, empty. Marcus followed Jamal's gaze to the trash can, and saw the rice scattered inside, the chicken half buried beneath napkins. His jaw tightened. Years in the military had taught him discipline, restraint, and control, but nothing prepared him for the sight of his child being stripped of dignity in a place meant to nurture him. Marcus didn't move. Not yet. He observed, the way soldiers are trained to assess a situation before acting. He watched Miss Peterson continue her rant, watched the students glance nervously between Jamal and the uniformed stranger they had finally begun to notice. Whispers started spreading like wildfire. Who's that? Is he military? Why is he staring like that? Jamal felt the shift in the room before he saw it. The air changed, the noise dropped, he slowly looked up and froze. Standing just beyond the tables was his father. For a brief second, Jamal forgot everything else, the hunger, the embarrassment, the ache in his chest. Relief flooded him, followed immediately by fear. He didn't want his dad to see him like this. He didn't want to be the reason his father got angry. Marcus met Jamal's eyes, and in that silent exchange, years of unspoken understanding passed between them. Jamal's gaze flicked toward the trash can, then back to his father. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Marcus nodded once subtly. I see. Miss Peterson finally noticed the uniform. Her voice faltered mid-sentence. She turned, her confident posture shrinking just a little when she saw Marcus standing there. Can I help you? She asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus stepped forward slowly, boots echoing against the cafeteria floor. Every step felt heavy, deliberate. I'm here to see my son, he said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority, the kind that comes from years of being listened to when lives depend on it. Miss Peterson glanced around, suddenly unsure. Parents aren't supposed to be here during lunch without permission. She replied stiffly, clinging to policy like a shield. Marcus stopped beside Jamal's table. He placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Jamal flinched slightly, then relaxed. My son didn't have lunch today, Marcus said evenly. Why? Peterson's eyes darted to the trash can, then back to Marcus. He violated school rules, she said defensively. Outside food is disruptive. Marcus looked at Jamal's empty tray. Disruptive, he repeated quietly. He turned his gaze to the trash can again, then back to her. Was it necessary to throw it away? A murmur rippled through the students. Miss Peterson crossed her arms. I was maintaining order. Marcus straightened fully now, his presence commanding the entire room without him raising his voice even once. Order without fairness, he said, it's just control. Silence slammed down hard. Miss Peterson's face flushed. Are you questioning my authority? She snapped. Marcus finally looked directly at her, his eyes steady, unblinking. No, he said. I'm questioning your judgment. The cafeteria felt like it was holding its breath. Jamal's heart pounded. He had never seen his father speak like this outside of movies or ceremonies. Marcus turned to his son, lowering himself slightly so their eyes were level. Did you break a rule on purpose? He asked gently. Jamal shook his head. No sir. Did you disrespect anyone? Jamal swallowed. No sir. Marcus stood again. Then what lesson were you teaching him, Miss? Peterson opened her mouth but no words came out. Her confidence cracked, just a little. The principal's office door at the far end of the cafeteria opened. Someone had called it in. Marcus didn't smile, he didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply waited. Because he knew something Miss Peterson didn't. This moment wasn't about anger. It was about accountability. And as the principal walked toward them, eyes wide at the sight of a uniformed soldier standing protectively beside a hungry child, every student in that cafeteria felt it. Something was about to change. And Jamal, for the first time that day, felt seen. The principal, Dr. Eleanor Whitman, walked into the cafeteria with the practiced authority of someone used to control. But even she slowed when she took in the scene before her. Hundreds of students sat frozen in silence. A substitute teacher stood rigid, arms crossed too tightly, and beside a small, hungry boy stood a man in full military uniform, posture unbreakable, presence commanding. Dr. Whitman adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. What seems to be the issue? She asked, though her eyes were already asking a different question. How did it get this far? Ms. Peterson spoke first, her words tumbling out too quickly. This student violated cafeteria rules by bringing outside food. I acted accordingly. Marcus Carter didn't interrupt. He had learned long ago that when people rush to justify themselves, the truth usually catches up on its own. Dr. Whitman turned to Jamal. Is that correct? Jamal hesitated, instinctively looking at his father. Marcus gave him a small nod. Yes, Mom, Jamal said quietly. But I didn't know it wasn't allowed, and it was my lunch. Dr. Whitman frowned slightly. And what happened to it? Jamal pointed to the trash can. The principal followed his finger and stiffened when she saw the remains of the meal. Rice scattered like evidence. Chicken half, hidden beneath crumpled paper. She turned back to Miss Peterson slowly. You threw his food away. Miss Peterson lifted her chin. Rules must be enforced consistently. Marcus finally spoke again. Consistency without compassion, he said calmly, is cruelty. The word landed hard. A few students gasped softly. Dr. Whitman inhaled deeply. Ms. Peterson, she said carefully, school policy allows homemade lunches. They've always been allowed. Miss Peterson blinked. That's not what I was told. Whitman's tone sharpened. Then you were mistaken. Ms. Peterson's face drained of color. Even if she was mistaken, Marcus added, what kind of educator throws away a child's only meal? Silence swallowed the room. Peterson's mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer that didn't make her look worse. Dr. Whitman glanced at Jamal again, really seeing him this time, his clenched jaw, the way he tried to stand tall despite the tremble in his hands. How often does this happen? She asked gently. Jamal hesitated again. The cafeteria seemed to lean forward. Not just to me, he said finally, but I think it happens to me more. The honesty in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. Marcus felt it like a punch to the chest. All the times he wasn't there, all the lunches Jamal might have skipped without telling anyone. Dr. Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line. Ms. Peterson, she said, step aside. Ms. Peterson bristled. I was doing my job. Marcus turned to her slowly. No, he said quietly. You were abusing authority. Dr. Whitman nodded once. Escort Ms. Peterson to my office, she said to a nearby staff member. Gasps rippled across the room as Ms. Peterson protested, her voice growing shrill as she was led away. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt final. Dr. Whitman turned back to Jamal. I'm sorry, she said sincerely. This should never have happened. She gestured to a staff member. Please make sure Jamal gets a full meal immediately. The cafeteria worker hurried off. Jamal's shoulders finally relaxed just a little. Marcus knelt beside him again. You okay? He asked softly. Jamal nodded, though his eyes were wet. I didn't want to cause trouble. Marcus placed a firm but gentle hand on his back. Standing up for yourself isn't trouble, he said. It's courage. Dr. Whitman watched them, something shifting in her expression. Mr. Carter, she said, may I speak with you privately after lunch? Marcus nodded. Of course. As Jamal was handed a fresh tray, warm food, more than enough, students around him watched in stunned silence. Some looked ashamed, some looked inspired. A few quietly clapped before stopping themselves. Jamal took his first bite, hands still shaking, but this time the food tasted different. It tasted like dignity. And as he ate, he didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt protected, he felt heard, he felt proud, and somewhere deep inside, a seed was planted, one that would grow into something stronger than fear. Something that would change not just Jamal's life, but the entire school. The cafeteria slowly returned to life, but it wasn't the same life it had before. Voices came back in hushed tones, laughter was cautious, and every movement felt measured, as if the entire room understood that something important had just happened, something that couldn't be undone or ignored. Jamal finished his meal quietly, each bite grounding him, each swallow easing the knot that had been tightening in his chest all day. Across the room, students watched him with new eyes. Some looked apologetic, others curious, and a few looked inspired, as if they had just witnessed proof that silence didn't always win. When the lunch period ended, Dr. Whitman kept her word. Jamal was escorted back to class with care, not urgency, as though the adults around him were finally aware that how they handled this moment would echo far beyond one afternoon. Marcus remained behind, following Dr. Whitman toward her office. The hallway felt sterile and quiet, the kind of quiet that magnified every thought. Dr. Whitman closed the door behind them and gestured for Marcus to sit. He remained standing. I'd prefer to stay like this, he said politely. She nodded, understanding. I want you to know, she began, that what you witnessed today does not reflect our values as a school. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Values are measured by action, he replied, not slogans on walls. Dr. Whitman exhaled slowly. You're right. She folded her hands. I've already filed a formal incident report. Ms. Peterson is a substitute, but that does not excuse her behavior. There will be an investigation. Marcus didn't soften. This wasn't a misunderstanding, he said. It was humiliation, and it didn't happen in isolation. Dr. Whitman hesitated. Has Jamal experienced this kind of treatment before? Marcus thought of his son's quiet nature, the lunches he never complained about, the days he came home too exhausted for a child his age. Children learn quickly who will listen. Marcus said, my son learned to endure. The words sat heavy between them. Dr. Whitman nodded slowly. That tells me we've failed him before today. She stood. This will not be swept away. Meanwhile in Jamal's classroom, the teacher paused mid-lesson when Jamal entered. The room fell silent again. Jamal felt the familiar urge to shrink, but this time he stood taller. His classmates didn't laugh. They didn't whisper. A girl in the front row gave him a small, encouraging smile. Jamal returned to his seat, heart still racing, but something inside him had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Not really. At the end of the day, Dr. Whitman made an announcement over the intercom. Her voice was calm but firm. Today, an incident occurred that does not align with who we are or who we aim to be. We are conducting a full review of our disciplinary practices. Every student deserves respect, dignity, and fairness. The words echoed through the halls. Teachers exchanged glances. Students listened closely. Peterson's name was not mentioned, but the message was clear: this was bigger than one person. When the final bell rang, Jamal walked outside to find his father waiting. The afternoon sun glinted off Marcus's uniform. Jamal hesitated, then hugged him tightly. Marcus held him longer than usual. "You did good today," he said softly. Jamal shook his head. "I didn't do anything." Marcus knelt to his level again. "You survived something unfair," he said, "and you told the truth. That matters." As they walked to the car, Jamal asked the question he had been holding all day. "Dade, why was she so mean to me?" Marcus stopped. He chose his words carefully. "Sometimes people carry fear and ignorance," he said, "and instead of fixing it, they pass it on. Our job is not to become like them." Jamal nodded slowly. That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table long after Jamal had gone to bed. He wrote emails, he made calls, not with anger, but with precision. He requested policy reviews, diversity training, oversight, accountability. He didn't demand revenge. He demanded change, and over the next few days, the school felt it. Teachers were called into meetings. Policies were re-examined. Students were encouraged to speak. Stories began surfacing, small moments of unfairness that had never felt safe to share before. Jamal listened as classmates whispered about things they had endured. For the first time, he realized his pain had a voice. And people were listening, but the biggest moment was still coming. Because Ms. Peterson wasn't done telling her side of the story. And when the school board stepped in, the truth would be laid bare in a way no one expected. The school board meeting was scheduled quietly, almost deliberately so, as if hoping the seriousness of the moment might fade if it wasn't announced too loudly. But stories like this don't stay quiet. By the time Marcus Carter walked into the administrative building 3 days later, whispers were already circulating among parents, teachers and students. Jamal sat beside his father in a stiff chair, feet barely touching the floor, hands folded tightly in his lap. He had never been in a room like this before: long table, microphones, nameplates, faces that looked important and distant. Ms. Peterson sat across from them, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. She didn't look at Jamal, not once. The board chair cleared his throat and began. "We are here to review an incident involving inappropriate disciplinary action and alleged discriminatory conduct." The word alleged hung heavy in the air. Ms. Peterson straightened. "I followed procedure," she said sharply when given the chance to speak. "The student brought food that disrupted others. I acted to maintain order." Marcus listened without expression. When it was his turn, he stood slowly. "My son's food disrupted no one," he said calmly, "but throwing it away disrupted his dignity." He gestured gently toward Jamal. "This isn't about policy confusion, it's about power used without empathy." One board member leaned forward. "Ms. Peterson, were you aware homemade lunches are permitted?" She hesitated. "I believed they were discouraged." The board chair slid a document across the table. "This policy has been unchanged for 8 years. Silence. Then something unexpected happened. A teacher requested permission to speak, then another, then a cafeteria worker. One by one, they shared small but troubling observations, patterns of behavior, harsh words, selective enforcement. Nothing dramatic alone, together, devastating. Jamal listened, eyes wide. He wasn't imagining it. He never had been. Ms. Peterson's composure cracked. "Are you all saying this is my fault?" she snapped. Marcus spoke softly. "We're saying it's your responsibility." The board recessed briefly. When they returned, the decision was firm. Ms. Peterson's contract was terminated. Mandatory bias training was approved for staff. A student advocacy committee was formed, with Jamal invited to participate if he wished. Jamal looked up at his father in disbelief. Marcus squeezed his shoulder. Outside the building, reporters waited, cameras flashed. Marcus shielded Jamal instinctively. "No statements today," he said simply. As they walked away, Jamal realized something profound. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly, told the truth, and refused to move. And in that moment, Jamal felt stronger than he ever had before, not because his father wore a uniform, but because his voice had finally been heard. The days following the board's decision felt different in ways Jamal couldn't quite explain at first. The hallways were the same, the lockers still dented and scratched, the bells still sharp and impatient, yet something invisible had shifted. Teachers greeted students by name more often, lunch monitors spoke softer. Posters appeared on walls about respect, inclusion, and student rights, messages that had always existed in theory, but now carried weight because someone had been held accountable. Jamal walked through the building with a new awareness, not pride exactly, but a quiet confidence that made his steps steadier. Some students stopped him between classes, awkward but sincere. "That was messed up. What happened to you?" one boy muttered. More often, lunch monitors spoke softer. Posters appeared on walls about respect, inclusion, and student rights, messages that had always existed in theory, but now carried weight because someone had been held accountable. Jamal walked through the building with a new awareness, not pride exactly, but a quiet confidence that made his steps steadier. Some students stopped him between classes, awkward but sincere. "That was messed up what happened to you," one boy muttered, eyes down. A girl from his science class said, "My cousin went through something like that. I'm glad you spoke up." Jamal didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, but inside he felt something warm replacing the old tightness. In class, his teachers noticed changes too. Jamal raised his hand more. He spoke clearly. He stopped apologizing before every sentence. At lunch, he sat at a table with other students who had once stayed silent, and together they talked about music, dreams, and things kids usually talk about when fear isn't sitting beside them. Marcus watched these changes from a distance, careful not to push, proud but protective. One evening, Jamal asked him a question that surprised them both. "Do you think I could be like you one day?" Marcus paused. "A soldier." Jamal shook his head. "Someone who stands up when it matters." Marcus smiled softly. "You already are." The school invited Jamal to attend the first student advocacy meeting. He almost said no. Public speaking still terrified him. But he remembered the cafeteria, the trash can, the silence, and he said yes. When his turn came to speak, his voice shook at first, then steadied. He talked about how hunger felt, how embarrassment felt, how powerful it felt when someone finally listened. The room stayed quiet, not with discomfort, but with respect. Teachers took notes. Administrators nodded. Jamal realized something then. His story was no longer just his. It was a bridge for others who hadn't found their voice yet. Outside the school, the story traveled too. Parents talked. Community groups reached out. A local veterans organization invited Marcus and Jamal to a dinner honoring service and resilience. Jamal stood beside his father, nervous but proud, and when applause filled the room, he understood that dignity multiplies when it's shared. Yet not everyone was happy. Online comments appeared. Some questioned the decision. Some minimized the incident. Jamal saw one post and felt the old fear creep back. Marcus gently took the phone from his hands. "The world won't always clap," he said. "That doesn't mean you're wrong." Jamal nodded. He was learning that courage didn't mean comfort, it meant truth. And as the school year moved forward, Jamal carried that truth with him, unaware that his greatest test, and greatest triumph, was still ahead. The spotlight never lasts as long as people think it will. For a while, Jamal was the name people whispered with respect, the kid whose story changed school policy, the boy whose father stood tall in uniform and demanded fairness without rage. But as weeks passed, attention faded, and in its place came something quieter and far more dangerous: resentment. It began subtly. A locker door slammed shut just a little too hard as Jamal walked past. A snicker that stopped when he turned around. A comment muttered under someone's breath. "Teacher's pet. Special treatment." Jamal tried to ignore it, just like he used to ignore everything else. But this time it felt different. Before, the silence had been forced on him. Now, he was choosing it, and that choice came with weight. One afternoon in gym class, a boy named Trevor finally said it out loud. "Must be nice," he scoffed, tying his shoes loudly, "having your dad scare everyone into letting you do whatever you want." The room went quiet. Jamal felt the old urge to disappear surge back, strong and familiar. His chest tightened. He could feel every eye on him. He thought of the cafeteria, the trash can, his father's steady voice. He took a breath. "I didn't ask for special treatment," Jamal said calmly. "I asked to be treated the same." Trevor rolled his eyes. "Yeah, sure." A few kids laughed nervously. The teacher cleared his throat and moved the class along, but the damage was done. That night Jamal sat on his bed, staring at the wall. "Maybe I should have just stayed quiet," he whispered. Marcus sat beside him. "Do you know why standing up feels lonely?" he asked. Jamal shook his head. "Because it exposes who was comfortable with things staying wrong." Jamal absorbed that slowly. The next day, something unexpected happened. A girl named Maya spoke up during class when another student made a joke about Jamal. "That's not funny," she said simply. Others nodded. The joke died where it stood. Jamal felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. He realized then that courage was contagious, but so was fear. The difference was choice. Weeks later, Jamal was asked to speak at a district assembly. The old fear returned full force. Standing on a stage, microphone in hand, lights glaring, it felt worse than the cafeteria. But when he began to speak, he didn't talk about anger. He talked about hunger, about dignity, about how small moments can shape a child forever. The applause was long and sincere. In the crowd, Marcus stood silently, eyes wet. Jamal stepped off the stage changed. He no longer wondered if he should have stayed quiet. He knew the answer now, and though challenges remained, he understood something powerful. His voice wasn't borrowed from his father's uniform. It was his own. Spring arrived quietly, the way healing often does, without announcement, without ceremony, just small signs that something broken was learning how to grow again. Jamal noticed it in the mornings first. He no longer dreaded walking through the school doors, his shoulders didn't tense at the sound of laughter behind him. He still remembered the pain, but it no longer owned him. The student advocacy group met every other week now, and Jamal had become one of its steady voices, not the loudest, not the most polished, but the one people listened to because he spoke from lived truth. Teachers began asking students for input before making changes. Cafeteria rules were posted clearly. More importantly, they were enforced with humanity. One afternoon, Jamal saw a younger student sitting alone, staring at his lunch like it might disappear. Jamal sat beside him. "You good?" he asked. The boy nodded slowly. Jamal smiled. "It gets better." He realized as he said it that he finally believed it himself. At home, Marcus prepared for redeployment. The uniform hung by the door again, a reminder of distance and sacrifice. Jamal helped polish the boots this time, careful and deliberate. "I won't always be here," Marcus said gently. "But what you learned, you keep that." Jamal nodded. "I will." On Marcus's last day before leaving, the school held an assembly, this time planned, intentional. Jamal was invited to present something of his own choosing. He stepped onto the stage holding a small, folded paper bag. The room went silent. "This," Jamal said, voice steady, "was my lunch." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "It was thrown away. But what it took from me and what it gave me changed everything." He unfolded the bag and placed it on the podium. "I learned that dignity matters. That silence protects the wrong thing, and that standing up doesn't mean standing alone." The applause wasn't explosive. It was deep, respectful, the kind that lingers. Marcus watched from the aisle, pride written across his face. After the assembly, Jamal handed the paper bag to Dr. Whitman. "Keep it," he said. "So we don't forget." She accepted it with both hands. That evening, Marcus left. Jamal watched the car disappear down the street, heart heavy but strong. He understood now that legacy wasn't about uniforms or titles. It was about what you leave behind in people, and Jamal was leaving something behind already. High school didn't change overnight, but Jamal did. By the time he reached his final year, his name was no longer tied only to that afternoon in the cafeteria. He had become a leader in quieter, more lasting ways. Teachers asked for his input when drafting student guidelines. Younger students sought him out when they felt unheard. He didn't see himself as special, just responsible. The advocacy group grew into a formal council recognized by the district, and Jamal was elected its first student chair. On the day the announcement was made, he thought of the trash can, the spilled rice, the humiliation, and how strange it felt that something so painful could become a foundation instead of a wound. College letters arrived in thick envelopes. Scholarships followed, many of them citing resilience and leadership. Jamal read the words slowly, remembering a time when people couldn't even look him in the eye. Marcus called from overseas whenever he could. "I hear you're changing the world," he joked. Jamal smiled. "Just my corner of it." During his graduation speech, Jamal didn't mention Ms. Peterson. He didn't mention punishment or anger. He spoke about choice. "Every day," he said into the microphone, "we choose who feels invisible and who feels seen." The crowd rose to its feet. As Jamal stepped off the stage, he realized the moment that once defined him no longer controlled him. It had shaped him, yes, but it didn't confine him. He was accepted into a university known for public service and law. On move-in day, Jamal packed a familiar item into his bag, a folded brown paper lunch sack, not as a reminder of pain but as proof of purpose. He didn't know exactly where his path would lead, law, policy, education, but he knew why he would walk it. Somewhere far away, Marcus watched a livestream of the ceremony in uniform, standing tall among other soldiers. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded, the way he had in the cafeteria years before. "I see." Years later, Jamal returned to his old school, not as a student, but as a guest speaker. The halls smelled the same, a mix of books, disinfectant, and something indefinable that carried memory. He walked slowly, noticing the subtle changes: posters about respect, inclusive policies, students talking openly without fear, teachers engaging thoughtfully. Everything that had once been a backdrop for humiliation now felt like proof of progress. Jamal entered the cafeteria, the site of his earliest, rawest lesson. A new lunch monitor smiled at him warmly. Students glanced up, whispering, some recognizing him from stories passed down. He smiled back. Standing at the front, microphone in hand, he addressed a room full of young faces eager to hear. "I want to tell you about a day I will never forget," he began. He recounted the spilled rice, the thrown away lunch, the silence that had once crushed him, but he didn't dwell on anger. He spoke about courage, about how speaking up, not seeking revenge, had shifted not only his life but the lives of countless others. Eyes widened, some students leaning forward, others nodding. You might think one person can't make a difference, Jamal said, but that's never true. Every act of fairness, every voice that refuses to stay silent, builds a foundation for the next person. You are stronger than you know. As he finished, applause filled the room. It wasn't polite, it was profound. Jamal looked to the back and saw the familiar figure of his father, visiting from base. Marcus's uniform gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Jamal's eyes met his father's, and for a long moment, no words were necessary. The Student Advocacy Council, now a thriving program, approached Jamal after the talk. They asked questions, sought advice, and wanted to continue the work he had started. Jamal realized then that his voice had become a bridge. One that others could cross, and one that would not break easily. Outside, a small boy approached him with his lunch bag clutched nervously. I'm scared, he said quietly. Jamal knelt down and smiled. I know, he said gently. But you have a choice. You can speak, or stay silent. And sometimes, just speaking is enough to start change. The boy nodded. Jamal stood and looked around the cafeteria one last time. From the trash can that had once held his only meal to the now lively, respectful space, he saw the full arc: pain transformed into purpose, fear into courage, invisibility into visibility. His story wasn't just his, it was everyone's who had ever felt small, powerless, or unheard. And as Jamal walked away with his father, uniform and dignity side by side, he understood the final truth: injustice can be turned into legacy, but only if you have the courage to face it head on. The cafeteria doors closed behind him with a quiet thud. A sound that wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Years had passed, and Jamal Carter was no longer the quiet, timid boy who had once sat alone in the cafeteria. He had grown into a young man defined not by fear, but by action. College had sharpened his mind, his voice, and his sense of justice. Law and public service were no longer abstract ideas, they were his tools to make a difference. Yet, no matter how far he traveled or how high he rose, he never forgot the smell of that cafeteria, the hollow sound of rice hitting a trash can, or the moment his father walked in, uniform pristine, and changed everything. One crisp morning, Jamal returned to the very school where it all began, not as a guest, but as part of a mentorship program he had started for at-risk youth. The hallways had changed subtly, new murals, colorful posters, collaborative spaces, but the essence remained the same. Students bustled between classes, laughter ringing freely, and yet Jamal could still feel the invisible barriers some of them carried. He walked through the cafeteria and paused, noticing a boy sitting alone, clutching a brown paper bag. The scene was painfully familiar. Jamal approached slowly, kneeling beside him. Hey, he said gently, mind if I sit? The boy shook his head. I don't know anyone here. Jamal smiled softly. I get that, I once felt the same way. Can I tell you a story? He began recounting, carefully, his own experience, the humiliation, the silence, the turning point when his father arrived. But he didn't dwell on anger. He spoke about courage, speaking truth, and the ripple effect one brave action can create. The boy listened, eyes wide. Jamal could see the spark forming, the first flicker of confidence, of hope. Around them, other students began to notice, and soon a small group gathered, quietly listening, absorbing lessons in dignity and courage that textbooks never taught. Later that afternoon, Marcus arrived unexpectedly, now retired from military service. He watched from the doorway as Jamal guided the young students, answering their questions, helping them stand tall in a world that could be unfair. Marcus's chest swelled with pride, not because of uniform or rank, but because he saw that the seed he had helped plant years ago had grown into something alive, strong, and far-reaching. Jamal noticed him, nodded, and returned to the students. It doesn't matter how small you start, he said. What matters is that you start. And that you keep standing, even when no one else does. By the end of the day, Jamal walked with Marcus outside the school, the sun setting behind them, long shadows stretching across the playground. I never thought it could come this far, Marcus said softly. Jamal shrugged. It's never about me, he replied. It's about everyone who has felt invisible, and now they won't have to feel that way alone. As they stood together, father and son, Jamal realized something powerful. The moment of injustice that had once defined him had now become a legacy that could transform lives for generations. The trash can, the spilled rice, the humiliation, they were no longer wounds. They were a story, a lesson, and a bridge. And standing there, Jamal knew his journey had only just begun. Years after Jamal had graduated, the story of the cafeteria incident had become legendary within the district. But Jamal wasn't interested in fame, he was interested in change. With his law degree in hand, he returned to schools across the state, not just to speak, but to implement programs that empowered students to advocate for themselves and others. Every school he visited had children staring cautiously at him at first, wondering why someone cared. And every school he left had students who understood something Jamal had only learned the hard way: silence is the enemy of fairness. One afternoon, Jamal received an invitation from a nationwide educational conference. He was asked to present his model of student advocacy, equity, and empowerment. Standing on a massive stage, in front of hundreds of educators and administrators, he felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but also a fire he had never felt before. He opened with the story of the day his lunch was thrown away, carefully weaving the narrative of humiliation, fear, and the arrival of his father in uniform. The audience was silent, leaning forward as he described not just the injustice, but the transformative aftermath, the advocacy programs, the mentorship initiatives, and the generations of students now standing taller because they had a voice. After the talk, dozens of educators approached him. "We need this in our schools," they said. "Our students need this guidance." Jamal realized then that the ripple had become a wave. Policies were revised across districts, mentorship programs were created, teachers began training on empathy, equity, and fairness, not because they were forced to, but because they understood its real impact. Back at home that evening, Marcus watched the live stream from his living room. Retired now, his uniform neatly folded, he felt a deep pride, not for himself but for his son. Jamal walked into the room, exhausted but glowing. "I didn't expect it to reach this far," he said. Marcus shook his head. "You didn't just reach far, you changed the way people think." Jamal smiled, remembering the boy he once was, the quiet, hungry child, watching the trash can, unsure if the world could ever be fair. "It started with one lunch," he said quietly, "one voice, one act of courage." Marcus put a hand on his son's shoulder. "And it'll continue with every student who refuses to stay silent." Outside, Jamal looked up at the night sky. He understood something that he hadn't fully grasped before: courage isn't just about surviving injustice, it's about turning it into a movement that outlives you. And in that moment, Jamal knew the legacy of that one humiliating day in the cafeteria would continue to grow, shaping young lives, building leaders, and transforming communities for generations. Years had turned Jamal's story from a personal struggle into a blueprint for change. What had begun as a single act of injustice, a lunch thrown away, a young boy humiliated, had grown into a nationwide conversation about equity, student rights, and courage. Jamal now traveled across the country, speaking to school boards, community organizations, and even state legislatures. Every speech began the same way, recounting the cafeteria incident, the fear, the helplessness, and then the arrival of his father in uniform. He didn't dwell on anger. He emphasized dignity, fairness, and the power of speaking up. One morning, Jamal was invited to a televised education summit. Cameras followed him as he walked into a room full of reporters, policymakers, and educators. Questions came fast. How can schools prevent discrimination? How do we empower students without punishing teachers unfairly? Can one student's voice really change a system? Jamal paused, smiled, and said, "It doesn't take a system to change a life, it takes courage. One voice can inspire many, and many voices together can transform schools, communities, and even policies." Across the country, social media picked up the story. Hashtags like #FeeStandForDignity and A Voice Matters trended. Students began sharing their own experiences, teachers began attending equity workshops voluntarily, and schools implemented mentorship programs modeled after Jamal's initiatives. For the first time, what had started as one boy's personal ordeal became a movement. Back home, Marcus watched Jamal on the news. The retired sergeant's chest swelled not with pride for the attention, but for the ripple effect. The lives changed, the courage inspired, and the dignity restored. "You've turned pain into purpose," Marcus said softly. Jamal nodded. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was every student who felt invisible, every teacher who wanted to do better, every parent who refused to stay silent. We all did this together." That evening, Jamal returned to his old high school for a ceremony honoring student advocacy. He walked through the cafeteria one last time, noticing the vibrant murals, the laughter of students, and the posters about fairness and respect. He paused at the same spot where his lunch had been thrown away years ago. He placed a small folded paper bag on the table, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of how one moment can change everything. As Jamal looked around, he realized the full truth: courage is contagious, justice can inspire, and even the smallest acts of dignity can leave a legacy that outlives you.